This show is part of One Place, a daily network of focused briefings across the stories people follow most.
Today, we start with a harrowing conclusion in Bradford, where a man has been handed a whole life sentence for a devastating arson attack that killed a mother and her 3 children. Then, we reflect on the dark legacy of the 2002 Soham murders and the community that was forever changed following the death of Ian Huntley. Finally, we look at the state of Texas, where a mass shooting, high-stakes primary runoffs, and a federal trial are providing a potential preview of the national political landscape.
It's a case that has left a community in mourning, but also one that highlights the absolute finality of the justice system. The sentencing hearing for Shiraz Ali in Doncaster Crown Court was incredibly emotional, ending with a whole life order. This is a rare sentence in the UK, meaning the 40-year-old will never be released from prison. Ali was convicted of the murders of 29-year-old Bryony Gaywith and her 3 young children, 9-year-old Dynasty, 5-year-old Oscar, and 22-month-old Aubrey. The judge, Mr. Justice Hilliard, was clear that Ali's intention was to wipe out an entire family, fueled by a toxic mix of jealousy, alcohol, and drugs.
The details of the attack are truly nightmarish. Ali targeted the house in Bradford in the early hours of August 21, 2024, because he was obsessed with his ex-partner Antonia Gaywith. Antonia, who had recently ended an abusive 7-year relationship with Ali, was actually the intended target. She managed to escape the fire, but her sister Bryony and the children were trapped. Antonia told the court she is haunted by the fact that they died because someone wanted to kill her, describing the torment as something she can never put into words.
The judge specifically highlighted Bryony Gaywith's immense courage during those final moments. When she realized Ali was pouring petrol around the house, she didn't try to save herself by running out. Instead, she stayed at the top of the stairs to protect her children. The judge expressed hope that her family would remember her for that bravery. It's a small comfort in a case where the children were essentially viewed as collateral damage by Ali, who blamed Bryony for his breakup with Antonia.
There was also an accomplice involved, 27-year-old Callum Sunderland. He was a crack cocaine addict who went with Ali to the house and actually kicked in the door to facilitate the attack. Sunderland was jailed for life with a minimum term of 18 years for manslaughter. The judge noted that Sunderland knew the house was occupied and agreed to an extraordinarily dangerous scheme. He essentially played with fire, and as a result, 4 innocent people lost their lives in a premeditated act of malice.
Antonia Gaywith's testimony was heart-wrenching. She described trying to get upstairs to her sister and the children while the house was burning, but she was covered in petrol herself and couldn't get past the flames. She was screaming and begging to save them, but there was nothing she could do. She told the court that the children were her joy, her babies, and she feels a deep sense of survivor's guilt, questioning how she can move on when they never had the chance to live their lives.
It's also worth noting the physical state of Shiraz Ali. He was actually rescued from the fire by police officers but suffered burns to 70% of his body. He was in a coma for a significant period and lost 2 fingers on each hand. Even during the trial, he required oxygen and had great difficulty speaking. Despite his own injuries, the investigation led by DCI Stacey Atkinson showed that Ali knew exactly who was in that house and knew they had no way to escape the blaze he started.
The whole life order reflects the severity of the premeditation. The judge was convinced that Ali had determined to burn down the house and everyone inside if Antonia didn't change her mind about their relationship. Since she didn't, he followed through with a plan that the court described as motivated by pure hatred. It's a final legal closure for a case that has devastated the Bradford community, ensuring that the man responsible will spend the rest of his natural life behind bars.
The impact on the family members in the public gallery was visible, with many sobbing as the details were read out. Bryony was described as having a warmth that could fill a room and a heart so big she would give the world away. Now, her family is left to pick up the pieces of a life shattered by a single night of violence. It serves as a grim reminder of the lethal potential of domestic obsession and the wide-reaching ripples of tragedy it creates. That sense of a community shattered by someone they should have been able to trust is a theme that brings us to our next story, looking back at a tragedy from 20 years ago. The recent death of Ian Huntley has brought the 2002 Soham murders back into the public consciousness. For those who remember that summer, it was a period of intense nationwide anxiety. 2 10-year-old girls, Holly Wells and Jessica Chapman, went missing on a warm Sunday evening in August. They were best friends, inseparable, and had been enjoying a typical summer day, listening to music and eating sweets, before they disappeared shortly after 6 p.m. What started as a local search quickly became a national obsession, as the days turned into weeks without any sign of them.
It's hard to overstate how much that iconic photo of the two girls in their Manchester United shirts dominated the media. The search operation was massive, involving 400 officers and countless volunteers. DCI Andy Hebb, who led the investigation, became the face of the struggle, his exhaustion visible to the cameras every day. But the most chilling part of the story is that the man who knew exactly where the girls were was often standing right in the peripheral vision of the journalists and police officers at the local college.
That man was Ian Huntley, the school caretaker. He was a nondescript figure who watched the entire media circus unfold from his small house. There were so many red flags in hindsight. Journalists recalled asking why the radiators in the college classrooms were running so hot in the middle of a warm summer, not realizing the gruesome reason behind it. Huntley even watched as police searched the wrong areas, knowing all along that the sightings being reported were false. He maintained a facade of being a helpful member of the community while hiding a monstrous secret.
The cruelty wasn't just in the act of the murders themselves, but in the emotional torture he inflicted on the parents during those 13 days of searching. He had taken the girls into his home for reasons that remain unclear and attacked them. It wasn't until he and his girlfriend, Maxine Carr, were arrested that the truth began to emerge. Entirely by coincidence, the girls' bodies were found in a ditch near RAF Lakenheath around the same time. A forensic trail eventually led detectives back to Huntley's bathroom, sealing his fate.
Soham was a quiet, pretty village in Cambridgeshire that few people outside the county had ever heard of before that summer. Now it's permanently etched into the UK's history of appalling crimes. The death of Huntley in prison marks the end of his personal story, but for the families of Holly and Jessica, the grief doesn't have an expiration date. They've had to spend the last 2 decades trying to make sense of a tragedy that was as senseless as it was heartless, committed by a man who lived right in their midst.
The Soham case also changed how the media and police interact during major disappearances. The level of scrutiny was unprecedented at the time, and the realization that the perpetrator was someone so integrated into the local environment was a wake-up call for many. Huntley's ability to manipulate the narrative for nearly 2 weeks added a layer of psychological horror to the case. Now that he is gone, there is a sense of a final chapter closing, though the lessons learned from that summer remain very much part of the national conversation on child safety.
It's also a moment to remember the victims as they were 2 young girls with their whole lives ahead of them enjoying a barbecue and each other's company. The focus so often shifts to the killer, but the legacy of Soham should really be about Holly and Jessica. Their parents, Sharon and Leslie Chapman, and Kevin and Nicola Wells, have shown incredible dignity over the years. They were thrust into a spotlight no parent ever wants, and their resilience in the face of such extraordinary evil is what truly stands out 2 decades later.
Ultimately, the Soham murders represent a loss of innocence for a whole generation. It was a time when the country felt smaller and more vulnerable. Even now, looking back at the footage from 2002 feels like a fever dream. The police and the media have long since moved on, but the village of Soham carries that weight. With Huntley's death, there is perhaps a chance for a quieter form of remembrance, focusing on the lives lost rather than the manner of their passing or the man who took them. While those cases look at individual acts of violence and their aftermath, our final story today examines how violence and politics are intersecting in one of America's most influential states. Texas has long been considered a bellwether for the United States, and the events of the past week certainly suggest a complex road ahead. On Sunday, a mass shooting at a bar in Austin claimed the lives of 3 people: 19-year-old Ryder Harrington, 21-year-old Savitha Shan, and 30-year-old MMA fighter Jorge Pedersen. More than a dozen others were injured. What's particularly striking is that the suspect had a documented history of domestic violence. Yet under Texas law, a civil ruling on family violence does not automatically bar someone from owning a firearm.
This tragedy occurred just 2 days before the state's primary elections, which have been dominated by scandals and intense intra-party conflict. In the Republican primary, the race for the U.S. Senate is heading to a runoff between incumbent John Cornyn and Attorney General Ken Paxton. Cornyn is a traditional conservative who helped pass the Safer Communities Act, while Paxton is a far-right provocateur who has been embroiled in his own legal scandals. This runoff will be a major test of which direction the Texas GOP wants to take regarding gun policy and institutional loyalty.
The primary for the district representing Uvalde also saw a significant shift. Incumbent Tony Gonzalez, a centrist who also supported the Safer Communities Act, dropped his re-election bid this week following a scandal involving an affair with an aide. This has paved the way for Brandon Herrera, known online as the AK guy, to take the Republican nomination. Herrera is an extreme gun rights activist and manufacturer who has built his entire platform on opposing gun regulations. His rise is a clear indicator of how the political winds are shifting toward more extremist positions in some regions.
Meanwhile, in North Texas, a federal trial is underway that could set a major precedent for how political activism is treated in court. 9 people are accused of belonging to a North Texas Antifa cell and participating in a shooting at an ICE facility. The case is being seen as a test of efforts to label left-wing activists as domestic terrorists. Interestingly, while the president has called Antifa a terrorist organization, there isn't actually a formal mechanism in federal law to charge domestic groups with terrorism. So prosecutors are using other legal avenues.
The trial itself has already been dramatic. U.S. District Judge Mark Pittman, a Trump appointee, declared a mistrial on the very first day of jury selection because he took issue with a defense attorney's shirt, which depicted civil rights scenes. Pittman then took the unusual step of personally selecting the jury members himself. He expressed frustration with the initial jury pool's responses regarding their views on immigration enforcement and gun rights. Legal experts are concerned that this case could lead to a precedent where simple mainstream activism is met with terrorism-related charges.
It's a complicated narrative because someone was indeed shot and wounded during a protest at that immigrant detention facility. However, of the 19 people arrested, 7 weren't even present at the protest, and none of them have a history of violent crime. The government's argument hinges on the idea of this being an organized terror cell, but defense attorneys argue that Antifa isn't an organized group at all. This trial is essentially a battle over the definition of domestic terrorism and the limits of the First Amendment in a highly polarized environment.
When you look at all these events together, the shooting in Austin, the shift toward more extremist candidates in the GOP, and this high-stakes federal trial, it paints a picture of a state at a crossroads. Texas often previews where the rest of the country is heading politically. If the trend is toward more polarized gun rhetoric and a more aggressive legal stance against political activists, we might see these same patterns emerging in other states as we move toward the general election. It's a lot to process in a single week for any state.
And it's not just the Republican side. The Democratic primary for the U.S. Senate also saw a high-profile win for State Representative James Tallarico, who has been in a dramatic conflict with Representative Jasmine Crockett. Every one of these races and legal battles contributes to a larger story about the identity of Texas. Whether it's gun regulation, immigration, or the right to protest, the outcomes here will likely resonate far beyond the state's borders. It's definitely a situation that demands close attention as these runoffs and trials continue to unfold.
That wraps up our briefing for today. This roundup is designed to keep you informed on the stories that matter most, with the depth they deserve.
If you found this helpful, please follow the show to ensure you never miss our daily updates. We'll be back tomorrow with more. Thanks for listening.